title for something that might not actually achieve all those things. And as much as I hate to start with any level of apology, I thought this was going to be a bit more of an outlier, but the fact that Eric's mentioned both negligence and risk management means that we're kind of in the same headspace. And the fact that this discussion arises from the contextual teaching that you engage in when you're teaching sports law might prove the utility for some of the lawyers in the room of all those long ago sessions of torts and statutory interpretation. I will concentrate on the internal management, the rules within the sport, and the final mea culpa is there isn't a single mention of Essendon anywhere in this. Now, the one thing that usually happens in a lot of sports contexts is people moan about referees' decisions. And a lot of the rules that get moaned about are things that have been changed, as was mentioned before. And a lot of those changes have been in response to the regulation of the increasing use of technology to adjudicate games. I could talk for hours about the technological and video adjudication. Perhaps the best latest example of the problems that those sorts of rules and the misuse of technology is the ending of the Australia-England cricket match about a week ago, which was charitably not well handled. There's also been a number of changes made to the rules of collision sports, and given my accent you'll understand that I'll tend to be concentrating on rugby union. But quite appropriately, a lot of sports bodies have instituted increasing protections within the rules to try and increase the safety and welfare of the participants, which overlaps with what you were talking about. But problems arise when those rules are either poorly construed or they're misinterpreted, and if that continues, then the integrity of how the way the game is played becomes damaged, and that's even more magnified when between games within international tournaments, if the rules intended to improve the welfare of players are inconsistently applied. Now, generally speaking, when you look at the rules of a game, there are two fundamental elements. We have the purely gameplay rules, for want of a better terminology, which is how you play it, how you score, what you do, how the game's actually played. And then it includes such things as we see in rugby union and rugby league, that you aren't allowed to propel the ball forward, specifically unique to those sports. The second major element is what we could call the safety or danger rules, and these are the rules that modify the application and hopefully the potential outcome of these gameplay rules to try and safeguard welfare, and to some degree include oftentimes prohibitions against violent conduct that is then automatically placed beyond the sanction, the implied sanction of the participants. The point being that voluntary participation in these types of sports generally involves consent to any type of contact that is permitted under the written or express rules of the sport, that if they weren't otherwise permitted would almost certainly amount to some type of assault. Now, that participation also implies consent to those contacts that aren't within the written rules of the sports, but are generally considered within the participants' contemplation of something that might happen if they're out there playing it. I don't want to spend too much time talking about consent, because if we got onto that, we'd be still here tomorrow. So a greater appreciation of the possibility and risk of long-term or late onset impairment resulting from certain of the collisions that actually routinely occur in these contact sports have led these bodies, controlling bodies, to modify the parameters and the scope of that implied consent. So many sports have moved to outlaw acts that they are increasingly seeing as unacceptable risk of injury. The problem is, what is an unacceptable risk? How do we define what's an unacceptable risk? Now, if force imparted during a collision sport is lawful because it's not intended or likely to cause harm, the consent of the participants would be operative, and then it's no different from the general rule which obtains to consensual violence that might happen out on the footpath. But actions such as physical contact on a playing field that are outside the rules of a particular game, particularly if they're far enough outside of the rules that they don't fall within the umbrella of this implied consent, may give rise to both a civil action for trespass to the person and or a criminal charge for assault. Now, that's particularly the case when you step outside a danger rule, which will almost quite often inherently result in some level of liability being imposed because of the type of rule that you have transgressed. Now, there is quite a lot of jurisprudence to prove this, albeit the cases have usually been decided under criminal provisions or as civil claims resulting from criminally sanctioned events within the game. Condon and Basie is a UK case that basically gives us the bottom line for the involvement of the criminal law in sport. That was a tackle by a defendant during a game of soccer football, depending on how you choose to call it, which resulted in the plaintiff sustaining a fractured leg. The court in that case concluded that the duty of care between players in competitive sports was a duty to take all reasonable care, taking into account the particular circumstances in which the competing players had been placed. And carry on with, and I ended up with a couple of Australian cases, which is quite good for where we are. In re Lenfield, the 13-year-old plaintiff suffered severe injury inflicted during an informal game of rugby when a 15-year-old of superior height and strength spear tackled him into the ground. Justice Higgins, at that point, took the view that whilst the tackle in question was executed for the primary reason of pursuing the proper objectives of the game, that the result was not a normal incident of it. And some of you might be aware of the situation with McCracken and the Melbourne Storm, which was Jared McCracken being spear tackled by Stephen Kearney and Marcus Bai, which resulted in some damages being paid. And the phrase we take from that judgment was that the tackle was not carried out as a normal incident of the game. But looking at contact sports, rugby league, rugby union, it will be almost impossible to establish liability then unless the actions of the defendant are outside the rules of the game. In Condon and Basie, the Court of Appeal even appears to be saying that a breach of the rules is virtually a necessary, albeit not a sufficient, requirement for any liability to attach. Now, there's nothing special about sports in that regard. Various disciplines have held, or it's been seen, that the rules and standards laid down by, let's say, professional bodies provide a good guide to the standards of reasonableness expected of the people who operate in those fields. So what that seems to mean is that a player acting outside those rules and standards will attract susceptibility to being found culpable at various levels for any injury or injurious outcome that results. In short, then, not every foul will constitute a tort, but something short of a foul certainly won't. So to continue that line of reasoning, if we borrow the language of the Tort of Negligence, that might help determine the entry level of culpability that's appropriate. So the question becomes, at what level do participants in any sport owe each other a duty of care on the sports field, which necessarily involves then a determination of the level of liability that attaches to any particular act. And for the purposes of this discussion, the question of greatest moment might then be, does greater culpability attach where a claim results from a breach of a danger rule, whether that breach is intentional or not, as compared with damage that might be consequent on the breach of a blame play rule? So torts lawyers look away now. Very generally speaking, the tort of negligence has three main elements. So a claimant has to establish that a defendant owed him a common law duty of care, breached that duty, and damage resulted. Now that by design admits any detailed investigation into issues of causation and remoteness / foreseeability, as well as investigation of any potential defences where we also place consent. So arguably, I think we can do that because for the participants in a sporting contest, particularly a contact sporting contest, determination of issues of causation and remoteness are usually fairly straightforward. You can see who's doing what and they're out there doing it, so foreseeability is not really an issue. And as I said before, the existence or otherwise of consent as a defence will vary depending on the nature of the sport concerned, the rules under which it operates, and the level to which breaching any of those rules is acceptably contemplated by the participants, for which we could go on for hours. So the primary aspect of the common law duty of care that is relevant to sport then is the need to avoid foreseeable risks which result in foreseeable physical injury. Following the tort lawyer's lines of inquiry then, we need to ask, is there a duty of care? And if there is, what standard of care is required? And particularly where we're talking about participants, which we will be in this case, to what extent does voluntary participation provide a defence? I just want to leave the voluntary participation to one side and concentrate on the substance of the duty of care and the liabilities for any of those breaches. Now, the existence of a duty of care should be easily satisfied. The codified rules of a game outline the duty owed by the player in respect of adherence to both the agreed gameplay rules and the danger rules and any contemplated result of those. Complete compliance, obviously subject to the on-the-spot interpretation of the game officials, which is where I started, and it's not always entirely satisfactory. They provide the immediate ambit and scope of the compliance. So the substance of culpability resulting from a breach of that duty is routinely then adjudicated as a determination that equates to the tortious standard of strict liability. So the common element to tortious claims in respect of a defendant who has not committed the act complained of either intentionally or negligently is that he may nevertheless be liable for the tort in certain circumstances, leaving again aside issues about vicarious liability. So those sorts of breaches are referred to as torts of strict liability. And any strict liability rule makes a person legally responsible for the damage caused by their acts and omissions regardless of any culpability. So under strict liability, causa and not culpa is paramount, and the liability follows from the occurrence of the damage at the defendant's hands, regardless of whether the behaviour was faulty. So the fundamental element is liability will be imposed without a finding of fault, and all you need to do is prove that the acts complained of occurred and that was the defendant that did it. But there is clear jurisprudence that sort of terminology, i.e. strict terminology, is ambiguous, and depending on the nature of the tort can't necessarily be assigned any particular constant meaning. And misleadingly, the imposition of strict liability is also in some tort contexts referred to as absolute liability, which seems to suggest that any defendant's liability is unchallengeable. In that context, absolute liability would require only the actus reus, whereas an act or omission might be excused in strict liability where specific mitigating factors are appropriately proved. So unless we're clear about what terms we're using, we actually end up with a few problems. Now, the point is that strict and absolute liability is better outlined perhaps in the criminal context where the two concepts are used less interchangeably. So the standard formulation for strict and absolute liability in crimes, for criminal liability, obviously for the criminal lawyers here, for criminal liability to attach, a perpetrator has to complete the specified actus reus while simultaneously possessing the necessary mens rea. As my old crimes tutor used to say, you have to be thinking the naughty thing while you're doing the naughty thing at the same time before it's a crime. The Senate Standing Committee for the Scrutiny of Bills outlined it like that. An offence of strict liability provides people to be punished whether or not they have a guilty intent, although there may be some recourse to such things as a defence for a mistake of fact. Now that reads very like the tortious prescription for strict liability, as it admits the possibility there might be factors that allow for a defence to the imposition of the liability, be it mistake of fact, mistake of fault, something like that. An absolute liability offence then is one where the defence of mistake as fact is excluded, so it's the same thing except there aren't any defences. So again, absolute liability requires only that you perform the actus reus, whereas strict liabilities are the same, but you might be able to escape liability due to some mitigating factor. Now, if we look at absolute liability, that fully explains the breach of a gameplay rule. If you breach a gameplay rule, you're adjudicated as being at fault, even when you're actually trying not to breach the rule. Most people playing rugby union, rugby league try very hard not to propel the ball forward, but when they do, they are considered entirely liable, no matter what the circumstances that it happened in. But I would suggest that counterintuitively, breaches of danger rules can't be conducive to similar absolute liability enforcement, particularly when the sanctions are imposed inconsistently. So we'll have a look at the wording of Law 10.4 from rugby union. The tackle, as you can see, is when the ball carrier is brought to the ground. And this is a rule that was, we started off with 10.4, you can't tackle somebody dangerously, but in the interest of removing any doubt for player welfare, there have been subsequent amendments to that, and in 2009, that was added. So you can't tackle somebody or try and tackle them above the line of the shoulders, and then it also suggests that even if you start below and it slips up, that will still be considered an offence. Now, So there seems to be subjective intention and absence of fault. In this case, not amounting to negligence might also be considered part of the offence. Now, it's not clear that adjudication of the amended rule as an absolute liability offence then furthers the objectives of player welfare, though absence of fault isn't necessarily relevant in a lot of these situations. Where there's no allowable mitigation of the liability rule, then we end up in a position where the logical extension is that all instances of contact above the shoulders occurring in all potential tackle situations are prohibited, which seems to be where you go if you take that to its logical conclusion. And if that's the case, then the game of rugby union and rugby league will be changed beyond recognition. So continuing the use of the language of fault used in tortious claims, unless there's some absence of fault analysis can be used to inform these danger rules, and therefore that they are imposed as strict liability offences and not absolute liability offences, then if we don't do that, then the coherence of gameplay in collision sports might be entirely changed. So there's a couple of examples of this happening, which were actually adjudicated quite differently, which adds to the problem. So this happened during the course of, unhappily for Australia, Argentina's first victory in the Rugby Championship. And the Australian fullback in this incident, Israel Folau, was penalised and initially yellow carded. He was presumably then determined to have transgressed law 10.4.I, which is the rule about tackling, but it actually prohibits you from touching anybody or making contact with anybody while they're in the air. So let's have a look at what happened. Unfortunately, the only copy of this I could find, it was played in Mendoza, and the only copy of it that I could find has the Spanish commentary.
9 para Fardi.
Sabéis que entró bien también Ortega Decio, que está ahí en la lista de tackles. Hablamos de Baez y Ortega Decio también está jugando un buen partido. Y nombremos lo de Agulla, porque Agulla es muy importante. Ataca el molde de los Wallabies. Se desprenden y cuidado por afuera, cuidado que se viene Folau, el kick de Folau, la pelota que rebota en Lucas González, tackle en el aire por parte de Folau, será tarjeta para Folau.
¿Y cómo quedó el jugador argentino, no?
Tarjeta para Folau, amarilla.
So do we get the idea? Okay. Nigel Owens, as you can see, is sending him from the field, yellow carding him. We probably don't have time to run on with the rest of it. He then viewed it on the big screen, and what's clear on the big screen is that it didn't actually happen exactly like it looks there, and having replayed it, the referee rescinded the suspension and invited Mr. Folau to come back to the field. Now what happened was, as Folau was moving towards the ball, he actually stops or goes to stop, and then was either pushed by one of the Argentinians, which also is a transgression of the rule, playing somebody without the ball, or he was sort of half sandwiched between two of them and stumbled. Either way, and Owens actually talks about him being pushed, he actually ended up hitting the Argentinian player, having tried to not hit the Argentinian player. And having adjudicated that it was a push, the referee then reversed the penalty, although he then bizarrely allowed Argentina to restart the game, which seemed to be entirely against what he had originally said. The point being that he seemed to be alive to the possibility of absence of fault, so even though Folau was originally determined to be responsible for the prohibited conduct, i.e. the absolute liability principle, when he reviewed the incident, he could see that it was the result of a push by another. So we're actually sort of getting in this whole much maligned area of a but-for test. But for the fact of being pushed, he wouldn't have made this foul, and therefore, although initially the absolute liability is correct, amending it to the strict liability determination based on issues of causation seemed to make sense, except for the fact that he didn't actually seem to get the penalty right. Now, the second incident, which we hopefully have time for, unfortunately happened while New Zealand held a 1-point lead with 3 minutes to go in Johannesburg, and resulted in a penalty which they converted to win the game. Such is life for All Black supporters.
Here's Reinach. Now Berger.
It's that.
All Blacks trapping the Springboks. De Villiers swings it wide for LaRue. Trying to wait.
move it forward a bit just so we can get a better look at it. Now here we go.
He was the first man who picked up the ball. Very good.
Oh, the crowd watching the replay.
Now you hear that crowd reaction. What was interesting about this incident was the game continued on for 30 seconds and stopped 30 metres up the field with the Springboks still in possession. And while they were setting the scrum, the TV commentators chose to replay that 3 times on the big screen in the ground, twice in slow motion, something like that, which created a huge reaction from the crowd. And the referee, while he was waiting for this, then walked back up the field and is heard to clearly say to the third match official, who was the person responsible for looking at these incidents, "Is there something I should look at?" At which point the third match official then replays it, and the referee determines that what happened there was a dangerous tackle and awarded South Africa a penalty from which they scored the winning points. We probably haven't got time to replay it enough times to see, but you can see the player on the ground there, Dane Coles, had actually tackled Mr. Burger while Liam Messam was preparing himself for a tackle. But for that tackle happening, he probably would not have made contact above the shoulder. Also, if you go back to the tackle rule, you have to grapple somebody to the ground, so he wasn't affecting the tackle. And the only contact that was made was Burger's head on Messam's shoulder. So the other proviso about tackling and slipping up can't be operative either. Now the other point being that if that had occurred and Burger had fallen faster and had contacted Messam's hip or his knee, nobody would have thought anything about it, absent any intention to do so. So, but Barnes then finally says he's made contact with the head, so it has to be a penalty. And if we go down that route, then we're ending up with every contact with the head under absolute liability principles, providing us with sanctions which would completely change the nature of the game. So the basic thesis is that yes, it's entirely appropriate that sports authorities are changing the rules for player welfare, but they have to be very careful how they adjudicate these rules on the basis that merely calling them absolute liability principles, or adjudicating them with absolute liability principles like they do with gameplay rules, don't necessarily achieve that welfare objective that they're trying to get to. So there we are.